May we start?
I want to get your opinion on something.
To the bigger picture. Now it's time.
From B Media Production, this is Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of season 4. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. In this episode, we talk branded podcast with Layton, the benefits, the opportunities right now, and what makes a great branded podcast. But first, I'm joined by my co-host, Nicole Goodman. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Nick. It's nice to be here again, but from the other side of Melbourne, looking at you through Zoom.
Yes, still in isolation, but we will push on because, as always, there is plenty to discuss. And I know you want to start by putting your marketing hat on just for a moment to discuss more generally why brands should be marketing themselves during the current COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, it's something I've been talking about for a little bit, and I read an incredible article from Daniel Granger, who's at Oxford Road Marketing, and the article talks about the benefits of actually continuing to market and advertise your brand during a crisis. What they did was look back over a number of years and a number of crises and how brands who continue to advertise actually found huge benefit in taking on that challenge. So they were looking at the recession of 1923, and they used a bunch of examples over the last 100 years. So Kellogg's in the 1930s, Toyota in the 1960s. The idea is with less competition, you can actually gain share of mind in the short term and gain market share in the long term. There are also some estimates that suggest brands that go dark during this pandemic will have around a 39% reduction in brand awareness, which is scary. There was also some research done by Millward Brown that showed that companies who cut advertising efforts by more than half during a recession can take between 3 to 5 years to recover to pre-recession levels. It's that number that really stuck out to me. The article does go on to say that brands that continue to advertise during a recession, they send a message of confidence, they believe in the future, and they're positioning themselves for even more significant growth when things bounce back.
Yeah, the stat that really stood out to me was that of the 200 companies they studied back in the original study in the 1920s, those companies that continued to advertise during the tough times were 20% ahead of where they were before the recession, while companies that reduced their advertising were 7% below their 1920s levels. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of what I was taught back in my uni days, being a commerce student, that when the market is contracting, which it is going to unfortunately in 2020, if your business can stake a claim in a shrinking market, when we recover, and we will, and that market grows again, your market share overall will increase.
That's right. The other upside for brands is that it's a buyer's market. There are deals to be had, and there are some advertisers that leave the market, sure, but there are spaces to be filled, and there are deals that publishers are making, and it's really a great time for brands to jump in and get a deal and try out podcasting, for example.
Absolutely. Podcasts are a cost-effective way to keep your brand in the market during the current crisis. So to that point, let's get to our chat now with Layton on this very topic. Corey was a guest on our first season of Podcasting Essentials. At that time, he was the Content and Marketing Director at Aussie podcast platform Whooshkaa. But a year ago, he went back to his radio roots as Commercial Product and Audio Partnerships Director at the Australian Radio Network, or ARN.
Yeah, look, it's fair to say that Corey knows a thing or two about audio and branded podcasts. So really, who better to chat with about the opportunities and benefits of brands getting involved in podcasting?
Indeed, but as excited as you were to speak to Corey, Nicole, your internet was not your friend last week, so I had to fly solo on the interview. But as you'll hear, I still asked your first question, and here it is. Welcome back, Corey, to Podcasting Essentials.
Thank you for having me back. Isn't isolation fun?
Fun's one word for it. Where am I speaking to you today?
I'm currently getting some vitamin D in. I'm sitting outside from my home in Melbourne, Australia, and you might hear a few dogs and birds in the background, so sorry.
No, totally fine. That's what it's all about during this isolation period, but enjoy the sun while you can.
I will. And trying to find somewhere quiet because the kids are running around the house. So here I am, ready to go.
Terrific. Now, to kick things off, I believe you have a Wikipedia page, which I'm not quite sure why that is, but my producer Nicole and the co-host here, who unfortunately couldn't be on this interview, has informed me that your Wikipedia page says that your name is Corey Layton, aka Captain Turntable, and also a purveyor of plaid shirts. Now, we've both seen you enough times to confirm the plaid shirt comment, but Nicole would like you to explain Captain Turntable.
It's funny, I still to this day get referenced as captain at work every single day and have for so many years. It's a horrible name and it's followed me throughout my life. Once upon a time, I used to be on the radio as Captain Turntable. I didn't come up with the name, a guy called Rod did, and it's just followed me throughout.
Well, thank you for explaining, Captain. I will be sure to use that name from this point forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
But on to more important things. Now, you're a radio guy who transitioned to podcasting via your former role at Whooshka. But you've kind of got one foot in each camp now because your current role is at ARN. But I'm presuming that you're working more on the expansion of the iHeart podcast network. Can you explain what the link is between ARN and iHeart?
Yeah, look, iHeartRadio for us means so much. Primarily, it's an all-in-one platform that includes radio, which most people listen for that live and local content. And for us, it's not just our local stations, but a bunch of Australian local stations and global stations, streaming music and podcasts. What it does is represents how we all naturally listen to audio. We all stack our audio, meaning you'll listen to radio for, as I said, that live and local content. Streaming music, primarily most of us use during the day to enhance or match our mood. And podcasts are really about educating and entertaining us, and now even being an escape given the current corona crisis. And so all those forms of audio, yes, it's all audio, but they all fulfill different needs for us at different times of the day. And what iHeartRadio does for ARN, it's part of a partnership that we've signed off until 2036. And it really demonstrates our confidence in not just the product, but also being part of listeners' lives as they switch across those formats. And for brands to be able to integrate and target listeners, no matter what format it is that they're listening to.
Mm-hmm. We really want to concentrate on the podcasting side of things, obviously, for this conversation. What would you say to brands that haven't yet considered podcasting? For you, what are the biggest benefits of the medium?
I think it's funny because for us having this chat today, and probably the majority of people listening, podcasts are nothing new. But for brands, they still are, and they're kind of like social distancing. Everyone's talking about it, but only a few know how to actually do it properly and can work out what 1.5 meters actually is. I think given the nature of the content for brands, they draw in a much more affluent, a more informed and a more influential listener. And there are countless studies that show that. I think for a brand as well, it's also a highly valuable audience. If you have a look at the studies, you can see that a podcast listener indexes higher in terms of their income compared to the average household. And so having a higher disposable income and for a brand to be able to tap into that type of audience is a really powerful and unique opportunity. And so I think as long as brands think about the listener first and not necessarily themselves, an angle, be it the branded podcast or the advertising or the integration, to think about the listener first, it's proven and continues to work wonders for brands.
With your experience, where do you think the greatest opportunities lie right now for brands to get involved in podcasting? I guess both during the current COVID-19 climate and then also beyond.
It's interesting how this current climate is changing things, because podcasts pre-COVID-19 were definitely about educating and entertaining and also informing. They're very much becoming that escape moment. The commute, sadly, is now a thing of the past, and that divide between home and work has vanished, right?
Yeah.
From the consumption data that we're seeing, we've seen this shift where podcasts are being used to provide that break and that moment away from being stuck at home working and being at home with your family. You need to escape, and podcasts are a great way of being able to do that, to stick on your headphones and to escape to somewhere. And we're seeing that always on listening really kicking off around 7 a.m. right through till midnight. And the times of seeing the commute consumption there have definitely flattened. And we're also spotting a sharp increase between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. because people look for that kind of lunchtime or late morning break to be able to escape. So when you think about all of that data, and yes, news podcasts are increasing at the moment, but so too is also entertainment and lifestyle and catch-up radio podcasts. We're seeing increases across all of it. And so for brands, I think aligning to those types of shows, or if creating content is something that a brand is interested in, do it in a way that can help transport listeners away, given they can't physically move anywhere or be transported anywhere. Creating content in that space right now is particularly a powerful opportunity.
Yes.
And I think for you and I, we both have kids and we're currently locked in our homes with our kids, which is now also our workplace, and needing to escape that. What we're seeing is that podcasts are providing that moment away. It's kind of like the time when you're in the bathroom and you can finally lock the door and just be alone for a moment. Podcasts provide that in some ways.
Yeah, it's very true. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, you're spot on, Corey, because in the past, anytime I got in the car, click, there was the podcast on a playlist ready to go. So it's definitely creating different listening habits.
Yeah, our routines are changing right now, and all of our lives we're trying to adapt to the new norm, and working out what type of media fits where is absolutely shifting, and I think we'll see it continue to shift. What's great for podcasts is we're seeing it continue to increase. It's just when it's being listened to is where the main change is.
Now, Corey, as a judge at both Australian and international podcast awards, you've heard the very best global podcasts, and I assume some of the very worst. So from all of that exposure, what makes a great branded podcast?
You need to take an audience-led approach at every single time. And that means finding the sweet spot between what your brand's business goals are, your strategy and your tone, together with the stories and the talent that your audience are genuinely interested in. There are a lot of brands that may say things like, how often is my product or price going to be mentioned? And if that's you, creating a brand podcast may not be the best direction. You might be better hitching a ride with an existing show with an existing audience. But provided, I guess, as I say, you're thinking about the audience first, brand-led podcasts can work wonders for a brand. Equally, not every brand needs a TV show, and the same goes for podcasts. So if you're in it for the right reasons, I'm all for them. But equally, there are lots of examples around the world of brands not doing them right or thinking of them more as an advertorial than providing genuine, interesting, informative or entertaining content for listeners and having their brand take more of a halo effect from that content.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more from our side here. But a question we often get asked by brands looking to start a podcast is, what's the return on investment?
That old question. How many downloads?
Well, is downloads even a fair measure of return on investment? Probably not. So at ARN, how do you measure the effectiveness of podcasts?
Look, some of those great stats that you also get when you create a podcast are things like average episode consumption, which typically comes from Apple Podcasts. From Spotify, you get a look in at a sample of your audience around gender and age. That helps. But beyond that, I think research effectiveness studies are always a strong way to measure things like awareness and recall and intent. Also, some branded podcasts have used measures like social sentiment, and seeing if there's been a change in that in the past has been strong. But enhanced measurement, not just for brand podcasts, but also for podcast advertising, is absolutely an area that is continuing to grow. There's now things like third-party tracking. There is attribution, which we are absolutely driving here in Australia, which is all about helping brands understand conversion to their platform and be able to see a listener move through the funnel. And those tangible real-time results is where I think podcasts can help make a difference, provided the industry gets behind these new initiatives and this new technology that helps really prove the power of what we're all doing.
You've touched on advertising a couple of times. I'd like to turn our attention to that for a moment. What are your thoughts on advertising effectiveness? And that's in the terms of the ideal number of ads in a podcast, the length of ads, the placement, and even the style that will resonate best.
They're very different to radio ads. I think radio ads are designed to engage a passive listener. We all know there are times you are listening to radio or streaming for that matter, and it's on in the background. And there are other times you're listening where you're highly engaged in a song, an interview, or a piece of content that someone's delivering, or for that matter, an ad. But ads in both radio and streaming are used to help listeners shift from passive to active listening. And to do that, things like voiceover artists and jingles and sound effects and even acting are commonly used. But if you throw that into a podcasting environment where people are already actively engaged, which is why it's hard, particularly if you have a desk job, to listen to a podcast while doing your job, it's because of that ads need to be crafted differently. And I think where podcast advertising comes into its own is when it's delivered by the host. And as countless of research studies have shown before, and many guests on this show have said, it's when a talent gets to deliver that message for a brand in their own style. You can't beat that. Equally, using a network voice to effectively create, I guess, a mini podcast in a way, can also work wonders for a brand, provided that they are story-led and designed to engage a listener.
How long can that go on as I guess it's still an ad inside a podcast? Is there a length that it starts to get too long?
It depends on how it's being integrated. I've worked on campaigns before with some significant talent who have taken a brand's message and made it into a 5-minute segment, which some people listening to this might roll their eyes at. But when it becomes really funny and just woven into the fabric of the show, it can be highly effective. Equally, if it's sounding forced, 5 minutes is way too long, and something a lot shorter is there. But I think the same rule that applies to how long should my podcast be also applies to how long should an ad be. And the metrics of every single other media format of it's got to be 15 or 30 or 6 seconds or 60 seconds don't have to apply to podcasts, because no one's timing out to the next ad or the news. They've just got to be the right amount of time to get the message across in an interesting way.
What's on the horizon for ARN and iHeart?
From a podcast perspective, we launched late in February into Australia, and we did that with significant scale, and that's both for our listeners to lean into a whole range of content that we've onboarded, and also for brands to be a part of. From here, we're continuing to grow our international slate for local brands, and we're also expanding locally. And what I mean by that is we're partnering with many of Australia's existing successful shows to help them grow their audience, and also launching new ones as well. And that's really about helping our listeners get over that podcast discovery problem where you have that Netflix effect. You open your podcast app the same as you do Netflix and you're overwhelmed with choice. And what iHeart in the US and here in Australia is showing is that by helping guide our listeners to some of the best local and global talent, we're able to help overcome that discovery problem and guide people better into what is some of the great content that's out there for people to lean into.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's all about discoverability, so that's terrific to hear. Now, final question, Corey. Looking more broadly at audio and podcasting, of course, do you have any predictions on what's ahead? And where particularly should early adopting brands be looking?
The crystal ball question. I think, look, as we all know, for those that work in podcasts, the space is constantly shifting, which makes it really exciting to be a part of. I think the onset of Corona is going to shift it quite quickly, and I think consolidation was on the cards. And post-Corona, I think we will see that just speed up. And what I mean by that is publishers acquiring hosting platforms and podcatchers acquiring creators, and all sorts of versions will happen. I think from a brand perspective, hitching a ride with the shows that your audience is talking about will continue to grow. And if you're creating a podcast, provided you're doing it for the right reasons, I think you should consider short form content now more than ever, as some of us are looking for other ways to escape from our worlds. Doing that with short form content, I think is a great opportunity for brands right now.
Certainly heaps to look forward to. And thank you very much, Corey, or Captain Turntable, for joining us on Podcasting Essentials.
Thanks for having me.
What a great interview, Nick, and I'm really sorry that I missed chatting with you and the captain this time.
Yes.
Maybe next time. Look, what resonated for me most from Corey is that the need for brands to lead with an audience-first approach. It's critical. But even before you do that, you really need to understand your own brand and what it is you have to offer your own audience. If you don't know yourself, you can't know what to provide to your audience. So it's a little bit of chicken and the egg, but you have to lead with an audience-first approach.
You just can't take your marketing hat off today, can you?
I'm sorry. Yes. The ROI chat you had also was fascinating. It's great that there's so much work being done on attribution, for example. So brands that can follow their listeners through the marketing funnel makes advertising in podcasts and brands creating podcasts that much more attractive. If a brand can understand where a listener is coming from when they listen to the podcast and then where they're going to, that's the information they need.
I look forward to being able to discuss that more later in the year as more technology gets developed, and I'm sure it's exactly what brands want, because that question around ROI is always very high on brands' lists when they're talking to us about producing a podcast. And just on that, to finish that point, is if you are a brand thinking about doing a podcast, if you're thinking editorial content and counting the number of times your brand gets mentioned in the podcast, that is not a branded podcast that will resonate well with your audience. You must be first thinking to be educating and or entertaining.
100%. It's about engaging your audience and, again, coming back to that audience-first approach. What does your audience want to listen to? What do they need to be educated on? The other thing that really stood out for me was Corey's crystal ball comment around short form content. If there was ever a time that brands need to consider podcasting as a medium, it's now. And also going in for short form content is a great way to dip your toe in the water. It can be cost effective and it's a huge opportunity, especially for those who are a little gun shy.
And on that note, selfless plug, apologies, but we have to do it during COVID-19. I really do extend the hand of support to brands looking for solutions and who may want to know more about getting involved. So if that's you, please do head to be.com.au, or you can reach us by phone or email, and we'll be glad to chat to you about how you can use podcasting to stay front of mind during these tough times. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me again, Nick.
Always a pleasure, Nick. Always a pleasure.
And from all of us at B Media Production, thanks so much for listening.